afternoon. Welcome to Tallahassee All Together, the City of Tallahassee's first virtual race relations summit. My name is Tatiana Daguillard with Blueprint Intergovernmental Aid.
And my name is Poonam Bhakta with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion.
And we are members of the 2020 New Public Servant Initiative Program. The NPSI program cultivates tomorrow's leaders today and is sponsored by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion with support from the City of Tallahassee's executive and leadership teams. Thank you all for joining us for today's Luncheon Keynote, Inclusive Leadership. During this session, our presenter will introduce you to a set of commitments you can choose to make and a set of competencies you can choose to employ to ensure that your leadership is in fact inclusive. You will leave this session with work to do and tools to use, all of which you can take action on immediately. But before we meet our presenter, let's go over a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded. The presentation is scheduled for approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes. If you have a question or comment, please type them in the chat feature anytime throughout the presentation. The chat and Q&A boxes are located on the bottom right of your screen. Only the host and panelists will be able to ask questions and comments. All relevant questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of this session, which will occur during the last 30 minutes. We will address as many questions as time allows, sometimes combining similar questions in an effort to cover a variety of topics. If you do not hear your question asked, it could be combined with similar questions. All points of view are welcome, and we ask that your questions be presented in a respectful manner. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. Please remember to complete your session evaluation form, which will be emailed to you following this workshop. Thank you in advance for your attention to this session, which was developed with you in mind. Now, let's hear more from Poonam about today's presenter.
Hello, everyone. I hope you are as excited as I am to be here today. My name is Poonam Bhakta, and I have the pleasure of working in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which is sponsoring the first virtual Race Relations Summit that is designed to bring our community together in the spirit of collaboration and unity. As Tatiana said before, we are both a part of the 2020 New Public Servant Initiative Program. The NPSI program is designed to cultivate today's leaders tomorrow. The program has given us the opportunity to work as moderators for the summit. We are so glad you are able to join us for our luncheon keynote featuring Joe Gerstandt as our guest speaker. Joe will be speaking from 12:30 to 2:15, presenting on inclusive leadership. Joe will introduce us to a set of commitments we can choose to make a set of competencies we can choose to employ to ensure that our leadership is in fact inclusive. A little bit about Joe is that he served 4 years in the Marines. After his time in the military, he spent 6 years working in management and business development for tech and communication companies. He then made a career change to work for a grassroots nonprofit organization. This is where he found himself drawn to issues related to diversity and inclusion, and then became actively involved in that work. He has a passion for helping others by discovering the value of awareness, honesty, and courage, and is a strong advocate for resetting the diversity and inclusion conversation. Joe sees his work as poorly understood and often misunderstood. Joe enjoys helping others interact differently by throwing out old rules and replacing them with creative new strategies that allow each of us to serve others better. And so please join me in warmly welcoming Joe Gerstandt.
Thank you, Poonam, and thank you, Tatiana, and greetings to everyone. I'm excited to be a part of this event. I have fond memories of being in Tallahassee for in-person conferences when we used to do those sorts of things. Today we're gathered virtually, but I'm still excited to be a part of this conversation. There's a lot of fantastic speakers and fantastic topics on this agenda today. A couple of things real quickly before I dig into the content. I'm kind of a fast talker. I'm also going to cover quite a bit of ground with you in our time together, so I always like to let folks know in advance I'm pretty easy to find. We're going to have some dedicated Q&A time, but if you have a question, a comment, or a complaint that we don't get to, feel free to reach out to me. Send me an email. I'll do my best to answer your questions or point you in the right direction. I'm also going to be sharing the slide deck with you. So all of the slides that you're going to see today, you'll get those, as well as a workbook that supports the content of this particular message. A little bit, you heard a little bit about my background. I want to add a little bit to that and tell you a little bit more about who I am and how I come to this work. I've been doing workplace diversity and inclusion consulting and advising and training as an external consultant for about 13 years now. And for better or worse, I've never focused on a particular kind of organization or size of organization or particular industry. So I've worked with about every kind of organization there is at this point. And some of the message that I'm going to talk about today is in response to, I think, what are commonly some of the blind spots or some of the gaps in how we approach this work organizationally. But I've been doing this work for a while as a consultant. Before that, I did this work internally. My last, I guess, real job was for a regional healthcare system where I led their efforts around diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency. And before that, I did this work in the nonprofit space. So I do this work now, and I believe very strongly in it. I believe that this work is an extension of my values and my aspirations and beliefs. And as true as that is now, it hasn't always been the case. If we were to go back in time a little bit and check in with me as I was becoming an adult, I was at a different place on a lot of these issues. I'm originally a farm kid. I grew up on a small farm next to a small town in Northwest Iowa. Pretty rural, pretty quiet part of the world. Went to a small school in a small town. I graduated with a class of 26 to give you a sense of the size. And for what it's worth, I graduated 13th out of 26. So maybe you can use that to kind of set your expectations for the next hour and a half. I've always been pretty committed to being mediocre in all things. But when I graduated high school, and I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but I graduated high school in 1986. If you'd have checked in with me when I graduated high school and I was 18 years of age about some of the issues that you're talking and thinking about today, if you'd have checked in with me on race and racism, if you'd have asked me if I was in any way, shape, or form racist, I would have said absolutely not. And I would have meant that. That would have been a very sincere response. But at that point in my life, my entire understanding of the concept of racism was simply blind hatred, hating someone because of the color of their skin, which had never made sense to me. So I didn't believe that I was racist. I didn't believe that I was capable of being racist. But at that point in my life, had I absorbed ideas, beliefs, attitudes about race? Absolutely, I had. But none of those things showed up as hatred. I didn't have any kind of strong emotion like that. But I thought I knew things about people based on the color of their skin. And it took me a while to even realize that. It took me a while to go out in the world and bump into people that were different than I was and learn things about them. And when I did that, there was these moments of insight where I was surprised to learn something about a person, which sometimes when I was paying attention gave me the opportunity to think about, if I was surprised to learn something about this person, then I must have expected something different. Where did that expectation come from? And one of the things that I came to realize fairly early on is that a lot of those expectations were simply rooted in racial stereotypes. And a lot of these kind of moments of insight happened while I was in the Marine Corps. That was the first thing they did after high school. And it was the first time I spent real time around folks that were of different races and different ethnicities. If you had checked in with me when I was 18 years of age and asked if I was in any way, shape, or form sexist, I would have said absolutely not. But again, at that point in my life, I had a pretty narrow understanding or idea of what sexism was. I didn't hate women. I didn't believe that women were inferior. But had I absorbed ideas and attitudes and beliefs that were sexist in nature? Absolutely, I had. And when I graduated high school in 1986, I was loudly and proudly and blatantly homophobic. So I think that properly understood inclusion is a journey. It's a journey for organizations. It's a journey for communities. It's also a journey for us as individuals. And part of that journey is about being honest about where we've come from. Being honest about where we've come from and what kinds of things we learned growing up about people like us, about people that were different from us, what kinds of interactions and experiences have we had along the way. I think the more that we're able to be honest, at least with ourselves, about that early part of the journey, I think the easier it is for us to be honest about where we're at today, and the easier it is for us to be creative and courageous in thinking about what the next steps forward look like. All of our journeys are going to be different because we're different people. We come from different places. The important point is to be on the journey. And I'm hoping that I'm going to give you some information and some ideas that will be of value to you today in this journey, both on the individual level and on the organizational level. One of the things that we're going to, and you heard a little bit about this in the introduction, this is going to be pretty focused on specific behaviors and commitments. And I think that in a lot of organizations, this is one of the missing pieces of this work. A lot of organizations don't get to the behavioral component of this work, and the behavioral component is a really important part of the work to get to. This is an image that I use for thinking about how organizations change and the different kinds of work that is involved. You've got these 4 layers of work. And the further down on this image you go, the more difficult it is to affect change, but that's also where the greatest impact and sustainability is. A lot of us probably aspire to informing and shaping the culture of our organization, of our team, of our community. But when I take a look at what organizations do in the name of diversity and inclusion, I see a lot of stuff on these top 2 layers. And we're at a point in time where you can see a lot of this going on. There's a lot of organizations today making new or renewed commitments to this work. And so they do a lot of the same things. They start diversity councils, they build employee resource groups, they develop a diversity recruiting strategy, they put out a statement of commitment, they maybe build a formal business case, they might start collecting some new data. And I'm not saying those things aren't valuable. Those things properly used can be very valuable. Most of those things don't have any direct impact on what it feels like to be an employee, right? I've seen organizations spend 2 or 3 years on these top 2 layers and a lot of money. And at the end of that 2 or 3 years, they've got a lot of activity to point to, but the employees inside the organization don't feel any more or less included. If you want to move that, if you want to impact the employee experience, if you want to actually deliver a more inclusive employee experience, the biggest lever for changing that is by changing the behaviors of the people around that employee, especially their manager. So it's really, really important that we are focused on getting to that behavioral component of this work, getting to a point where we can delineate these are inclusive behaviors, they will be coached and expected and rewarded, and these are non-inclusive behaviors and they will not be allowed. Right? We've got to get to that point, and we've got to get to that point for a number of reasons. It's important for a number of different reasons that we get there. First of all, as I've already mentioned, I think behavior is the most direct and probably the cheapest and most efficient way that you can impact the employee experience, that you can actually start creating a more inclusive employee experience. The behavioral piece is also how we solve for accountability. And accountability is one of the biggest conversations in this work right now. How do we hold folks accountable, especially middle managers? That's maybe the loudest question that I hear in this work today. We've got unprecedented support today at executive levels, but if you go a layer or 2 down, a lot of that disappears. How do we hold those folks accountable? Well, a big part of the answer to that is we have to set clear behavioral expectations. This is what inclusive leadership and management looks like. And then we've got some stuff to hold folks accountable to. We identify those behaviors and those leadership practices. We can write that stuff into job descriptions. We can make it part of performance evaluations. It's actually fairly easy to hold folks accountable once you identify the behaviors that are expected of them. Identifying these behaviors is also helpful in hiring and promoting the right folks. A lot of organizations today have some amount of focus on doing a better job of hiring a more diverse workforce. There's not very many organizations that are focused on making sure that they're hiring and promoting people who are willing and able to behave and lead in inclusive ways. So we continue to make the work more difficult. We might be hiring more diversity, but we're also hiring and promoting people that are not willing or able to interact and to lead in inclusive ways. That's problematic. If this stuff matters, then it should show up in hiring decisions and promotion decisions. There should be questions about inclusive behavior and inclusive practices in interviews. There should be D&I language in all job descriptions. That helps us make sure that we're hiring the right folks that are aligned with the values and the priorities of the organization. Identifying these behaviors is also how you do a good job of making sure you're bringing the right kinds of training into your organization. Again, this is also how you change the culture. You can have all the programs you want, You can change all the policies you want. Until you start changing the way individuals and groups behave, you're not really changing the culture. And one additional reason why this is important is you can do a better job of setting the right expectation for new folks. There's a lot of organizations that today will tell you as a new employee that we value inclusion here, but they can't really say a lot more about it than that. They don't. So what you can expect is still kind of vague and ambiguous. It would be kind of nice for you able to say, welcome to the team, we value inclusion here, and this is what that means. This is how you can expect to be treated. This is how you can expect to be led. You've got a much more valuable expectation for folks coming into the organization. So in the behaviors and the competencies and commitments that I'm going to talk to you about today, this isn't an exclusive list or an exhaustive, comprehensive list. And I think the behaviors can also vary from organization to organization because organizations are different, cultures are different. But I think it's a good starting place. It's some commitments, and some of them are specific to management, some of them are not. But it's commitments and behaviors that drive and lead to a more inclusive experience. And one of the reasons why I've developed this content is because it is so often lacking in organizational efforts. One of the other things that's lacking in organizational efforts is that even though we are increasingly coming together to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity and belonging, we're still rarely talking about the same thing. Most organizations do not have a common language. We're using the same words, but everyone's talking about something different. So I believe one of the most valuable things you can do in your organization is to make sure you've got that common language in place. When we say diversity in this building, when we say inclusion in this building, this is exactly and specifically what we mean. That seems like a pretty important foundational part of this work. A lot of organizations today are putting out big, beautiful statements of commitment to diversity, to inclusion, but if you can't tell me what those things mean in simple language, I'm not sure what to do with your statement of commitment. I don't know how you pick your strategies or your tactics or your metrics. And so I think this common language is an important part and a foundational part. I think it's worth some effort. I think you've got to get together with some people, you've got to lock yourself in a room, and you've got to spend some time thinking and arguing about words. Having clear, concise definitions for the people in your organization, I think is much more valuable than any statement of commitment is ever going to be. Making sure that you're talking about the same thing. A little bit about how I use these words, and I'm going to focus primarily on the words diversity and inclusion today. When I look diversity up in the dictionary, it tells me that it means difference. And so kind of one way to think about diversity for me is it's about the ingredients. It's about the mix of different identities and different perspectives and different experiences that we're including in a group, in a team, in an organization. And the work of inclusion is really about that container. What kind of container are we putting that mix inside of? Is it a strong container? Is it an intentional container? And I think most of the work of inclusion is still in front of us. There are organizations that are doing a better job of hiring folks that look different from them. There's still not a lot of organizations that have made it safe to actually be different at work. So to some extent, we're putting more and more diversity into a container that doesn't actually value diversity yet. That container is really, really important because it determines the outcome. There are some people that will tell you diversity automatically makes things better, and they will point to their examples. There are some people that will tell you diversity automatically makes things worse, and they will point to their examples. The underlying truth of what diversity does is it makes groups different. As a social group gets more diverse, things are going to get better or they're going to get worse. Diverse groups consistently overperform or underperform groups with less diversity. Diversity changes social groups. It's a catalyst because it makes groups more complex. I'll give you a specific example of that complexity. Think about a work team for a second. As a work team gets more diverse, as it has greater diversity in perspective and identity and experience, it also has greater potential for tension and conflict and disagreement. Now, in the right setting with the right group, that's really, really valuable. The ability to disagree well is probably one of the highest level skill sets there are. So if the team has that ability, has that healthy relationship with disagreement, that diversity is really, really valuable and it drives really good outcomes. But a lot of teams don't have the ability to disagree well. They avoid serious disagreement at all costs. So you've still got the same mix of ingredients, but it's in a different kind of container. And if it's not in the right kind of container, as that group gets more diverse, things are going to get worse because you've got more unacknowledged conflict, you've got resentment, you've got greater in-group, out-group dynamics. So it's important for us to continue focusing on the diversity aspect of this work. It is every bit as important to make sure that we're focusing on the inclusion component of this work, making sure that we're bringing that increasing mix of diversity into a container that actually values, that actually sees diversity as a source of value rather than an obstacle or a barrier or a challenge or something to be tolerated. Same mix of ingredients, different kinds of containers, different kinds of outcomes. A little bit more specifically regarding the word inclusion, I use this word in a couple of different ways. I use it to talk about the active process of change. Those are the things that we do as an organization, as individuals, as a team to be more inclusive. And then I also use it to talk about the experiential outcome. What does it mean to be included in your organization? And that last piece, that experiential outcome, I think that's the most, maybe the most important one that you have to have some real clarity around. You need a definition, you need a framework, you need to capture that in language. What does it mean to be included in this organization? What does it look like and sound like and feel like? How do we know when it's happening? How do we know when it's not happening? Once you get that clarity, because that's kind of the product. If we're committed to this work, the product is a more consistently inclusive employee experience for our employees. If it's our product, we should be able to speak to its characteristics. And if you can do that, then it becomes a lot easier to work backwards from that and say, this is what we're trying to deliver to our employees. And based on that, these are the behaviors, the practices, and the policies that we need to have in place. Again, I think that common language is really important. When I talk to people that believe they work in a place that's inclusive or have worked in a place that is inclusive, when I ask them to explain what that feels like, these are the things that they say. The idea of bringing my whole self to work comes up again and again in this conversation. I'm sure that you've heard that language yourself. And I think on the individual level, that kind of captures what we're talking about. Bringing your whole self to work, and it's not quite your whole self. Work is different from home, although it's not quite as different now as it was a year ago, but work and home are different. It's not quite your whole self. You have joined an organization, but how much of yourself do you have to check at the door? How much of themselves do your peers, your employees have to check at the door? How hard do employees have to work to fit in at an organization that has chosen them? Right? We want that to be as little as possible. That's incredibly wasteful. We don't want employees, people on the payroll, investing their emotional and cognitive resources trying to fit in. We want them to direct all of that stuff at the work at hand. But on the individual level, I think this idea of whole self captures a big chunk of what we're talking about. And I've got a framework that I like to share with folks. If you don't have any language or a definition or a model of that experiential outcome of being included, if you don't have anything like that in place, I think this is maybe a good place to start. I like this model. It's fairly simple. I think it's fairly intuitive and fairly actionable. I came across this model a few years ago in the Journal of Management. And this model is based on, it's kind of anchored in the reality that two of the greatest needs we have as human beings are, one, the need to be accepted, the need to belong, to be a part of. That probably drives more behavior than anything on this planet. We have a really strong need to be accepted. And we also have a need to be unique. We want to be a part of, but we don't want to be a carbon copy of the people around us. And this model is based on the idea that a place or a space that meets both of those needs at the same time, that's kind of what inclusion is. So we're looking at these two variables. In my department, in my team, in my organization, how much do we reward and promote belongingness? And how much do we reward and promote uniqueness? And if we're doing a good job of both of those things, that's what inclusion is. And inclusion is, as they define it, a situation where I'm treated as an insider and still allowed or encouraged to retain my uniqueness within the work. So I can be an insider, but I'm different than everybody else, and we all know it, and it's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. It's not a source of tension. It's not something that we have to pretend doesn't exist. I can be an insider, and I can still be true to who I am. And I know that with some folks, that phrase insider has kind of a negative connotation. Try to think about it a little bit differently here. I think it's a good word, but I know for some folks it has a negative connotation. So inclusion is different than what they call in this model exclusion, and the way they've defined it here. I don't see much of this in the workplace. It's different than what they call differentiation in this model as it's defined here. I don't see a lot of that in the workplace either. What I do see a lot of is what they call in this model assimilation. In fact, I would say this is kind of the default way of operating for most organizations, most departments, most teams. I can still be an insider, but I've got to conform to some unwritten rules and downplay some of my uniqueness and my differences. And I think this is where most organizations and most teams are. And I don't think it requires any incompetence or any bad intentions. I think because of human nature, I think because we've got such a strong desire to fit in, I think because of the way we build organizations and the way we deploy the practice of management, I think assimilation kind of happens on its own. And this is a specific kind of assimilation. Some assimilation is good. Some assimilation is required, right? You've joined an organization. You should be expected to assimilate towards shared values, performance expectations, policy standards. All of that stuff is non-negotiable. This is a different kind of assimilation. This is assimilation to the dominant culture and to the unwritten rules of the workplace. One of the things I like about this model is I think it's fairly intuitive. I think you don't have to be a subject matter expert. If you're a leader of human beings and you understand inclusion as this mix of belongingness and uniqueness, if you've got a team that's maybe lacking in inclusion, I think you can start to figure out some ways to change that. There's probably some fairly simple things you can do to invite and reward and promote more uniqueness in your team or in your department. And you might have some work to do on the belongingness side as well. Usually, most of the work is on that uniqueness side. And sometimes folks ask me for a specific example of what that looks like. And I think a great place to start is telling the truth. That's one of the ways in which uniqueness shows up. And I think that, when I think about inclusion on a very fundamental level, that's what it's about. You and I, regardless of who you are, regardless of who I am, we've joined the same organization. So can I tell you the truth and can you hear it? Can I tell you the truth about who I am? Can I tell you the truth about my opinions and my perspectives on the work that we're doing together? Can I tell you the truth about my experience in this building, in this organization, in this community, and can you hear those things? I don't think that captures the entirety of inclusion, but I think it captures a big fat chunk of it in the middle. It's about creating spaces and places where people who are naturally different from each other can tell the truth to each other. So when you think about uniqueness, one of the ways you can make sure that's showing up is do people on your team, department, organization feel safe telling the truth to each other? Maybe a specific example of that is, are they willing and able to disagree with each other? Because those are some of the hardest truths to tell. Are they willing to share bad news with each other? Some of the hardest truths to tell. So that's an example, a couple of examples of how the uniqueness shows up. And in this model, inclusion and assimilation aren't technically opposites, but I like to set them up this way. And I use this particular diagram to invite a lot of conversation. We've got a definition on one side of what we're going for. We've got a definition on the other side of what we're not going for. On this 1 to 10 scale, how would you rate your experience here in this department, in this team, in this organization, and why? Tell me why it's a 2, why it's a 5, why it's an 8. In my experience, this can be a tool for inviting some fairly actionable conversations. And it's also a good way to demonstrate to everyone that while we like to think we're all having the same experience in an organization, that's never the case. We're always having a different experience. And so it's important that we find time and space to share those stories so that we can all have a greater and more accurate shared understanding of the workplace. So just a little bit of foundational stuff kind of underneath the inclusive behaviors. I think it's important to know that inclusion is an activist thing. It's not about what you say, it's not about your intentions, it's about the things that you do deliberately and proactively to be inclusive. And so if you're going to say that you're inclusive as a leader, if you're going to say that you're inclusive as an organization, you should be prepared to also say, and this is how it shows up in my behavior. This is how it shows up in my actions. This is how it shows up in my decision making. Which brings us to some of those things, some of those commitments and some of those competencies. And I've got 4 buckets of stuff that I'm going to go over with you. And there's a lot of different things that could be included in each of these 4 buckets, but in each of the buckets, I'm gonna kind of lift up 3 specific things that might be competencies or behaviors that you might be willing or able to commit to in your own leadership, or might be valuable in taking back to your organization. And the first bucket of commitments and behaviors is very much focused on self. We've got to start by focusing on ourselves, and sometimes that throws folks off. They want to get out there and start learning about other people, but there's a fair amount of this work that is internal. And so here's a slide with way too many words on it. I'm not gonna read these words to you or encourage that you read them. You'll have these slides. You can come back and review this later on. This is just some language that kind of frames the stuff that is in this bucket. A few specific things that I want to talk to you about in this bucket. I think one of the most important things, I alluded to this earlier, one of the most important things I think you can do to make sure that you're on your own individual journey is to spend some time thinking about and reflecting on that journey. What has been your story? As I mentioned earlier, what kinds of things did you learn growing up about people like you? What kinds of things did you learn about people different from you? Where did you learn those things from? Did you have interactions with people that were different from you? What were those interactions like? What did you learn later in life? I think it's important to spend some time thinking and talking about that, because I think that's a valuable thing to share with other folks. I think it's valuable to share that. I think it's especially valuable for leaders. There are people in the organization that are going to hear those things when they come from leaders differently than they're going to hear them from me as an outside consultant, differently than they're maybe going to hear from you as an HR leader or a D&I leader in your organization. Those personal stories, those personal narratives, I think are some of the most valuable tools for change in your organization. So getting comfortable talking publicly and privately about your own personal experience with diversity, with inclusion, with these other topics. One of the, I think, most important parts of that narrative is the personal why, the personal case for why you care about this stuff. And some folks probably don't have that clarity today. So again, spend some time reflecting on it. In the workbook that you're going to get with the slide deck, there's some questions for reflection that help you think about some of that stuff. Formal business cases are great, and I think your organization needs to have a formal business case. I don't think formal business cases ever change the hearts and minds of other people. What does change the hearts and minds of other people is this personal narrative, this personal case for diversity inclusion, shared by an individual in their own language, telling their own story. That's a powerful, powerful tool. So for yourself and for leaders in your organization, giving them some time and some space to reflect on and to get some clarity around that narrative, and maybe some opportunities to start practice sharing it, it's a really powerful tool for change. I think in this first bucket, it's also really important to start becoming aware of the concept of privilege. And for some folks, privilege is kind of a divisive word, and I get it. When someone sat down with me the first time and tried to convince me that I was a person of privilege, I kind of wanted to fight. I got very defensive. I was very offended, which is hysterical because I'm a person literally dripping with privilege, but I didn't understand what they were talking about. This is another example of me having kind of a narrow understanding of what they were talking about. When they said privilege to me, what I heard them say was that I'd never had to work for anything. Simply because of who I was, I had had things given to me, and that didn't reflect my experience at all. I had not at that point had a life of tremendous adversity, but I had worked hard. I'd worked hard for things. And so I was offended at this idea that I was a person of privilege. But when we talk about privilege in this context, that's not really what we're talking about. And I actually I'm gonna share a couple of slides specific to privilege here. When we talk about social privilege, what we're talking about is relative or unearned advantage. Privilege doesn't have anything to do with what you've done or not done as an individual, so there's really no reason to be offended or irritated by the idea. It's not about you as an individual, it's simply about the groups that you belong to. Some aspect of your identity in some situations gives you a certain amount of unearned advantage or relative advantage. I'll give you a couple of examples. For those of us that were born in this country, we didn't do anything to earn that, but it gives us a certain amount of advantage. Being born in this country means there are some things that we can take for granted that many of the other 7 billion people on this planet cannot take for granted. Again, we didn't do anything to earn it. We didn't do anything to create that situation, but we benefit from it. There are things that we simply don't have to think about or worry about simply because of where we were born. Another example of privilege or relative advantage is prior to about the middle of March of this year, I used to travel kind of all of the time. Most of my work takes me on the road, and I travel outside of the States. I travel all the time in the States, and I go all over the place. I move very freely. different cities, different parts of cities. I go around all times of day, all times of night. And in my entire life, I can probably count on one hand the number of times I've even thought about my physical safety, let alone being concerned about my physical safety. And that's not me being foolish or naive. Statistically speaking, I'm a safe person. I'm a straight white middle-aged man. If I stay out of prison for the rest of my life, the chances of me ever being physically assaulted are very, very, very low. The same is not true for everyone in this conversation, and we all know that. The numbers are very different. We all know that because we start teaching women very different things about their physical safety at young ages. We tell women to avoid dark parking garages. We tell women to, if they find themselves in a dark parking garage, to have their keys in their hand in case they have to stick somebody in the eyeball. And that's not because of urban myth. Statistically speaking, they are much more likely to be assaulted, especially women between the ages of 14 and 24 is the highest risk group. Now, again, I didn't do anything to create that situation. The women in this conversation didn't do anything to create that situation, but because of my identity, I have a little bit of unearned advantage. When I'm packing for a trip, I don't need to be packing with my safety in mind. When I schedule my day, I don't have to do it with safety in mind. There's a lot of things that I simply don't have to do or even think about because of my identity and the access that that gives me to things. So I think it's important to be aware of this idea of advantage. And most of the people in this conversation probably, there's some aspects of your identity that advantage you, and there's maybe some aspects of your identity that disadvantage you. That's probably true of many of the people on this conversation. Being aware of privilege, being aware of your privileges is important, I think, especially for leaders. If you're a leader and you don't have any concept of privilege, I think you will start to see meritocracy and talent where they do not exist. And I think there's pretty big consequences to that. One last example of privilege I'll share with you is a few years after I started my business, I got invited to spend a day with a healthcare system in Michigan. And we did a number of different things that day, but the main thing that they brought me in was to make a presentation to their executive leadership team. I had 30 minutes with this group of people, and it was 9 men, 7 white men and 2 African-American men. I had 30 minutes and I went in and I made my presentation and it went very well. And they told me so. They said really fantastic things to me. A couple of them pulled me aside and said things like, "That's the best thing I've ever heard on diversity inclusion." One of them said, "First time this makes sense to me." All of that sounded fantastic. I desperately wanted to believe those things. They sounded fantastic. Those words made me feel very good about myself. At the end of that day, the woman who had hired me to come and do this day's work took me out to dinner. African-American woman, their VP of HR, not on the executive leadership team. And we had a wonderful dinner and a wonderful conversation. And at the end of that conversation, she tells me this. She says, "You did really good work for us today. I'm appreciative. I also think it's important for you to know that you didn't tell those 9 men anything that I haven't said to them before. I brought you here because I needed those men to hear those things." So here's an example of me even doing this work, going into an engagement, not thinking about privilege, not thinking about the privilege that I walked into that room with. And when I walked out of that room, all I could see was my own talent, right? Because of this feedback I had gotten. And hopefully I took a little bit of talent into that room that day, but that certainly was not the only thing at play. There was other things at play. Here's a woman on the payroll of that organization who had said all of those things to those men before, and they had not heard her. There's unfortunate consequences to that organization for that. There's unfortunate consequences to that employee for that. If I would have walked into that with my privilege top of mind, I could have done a better job of more intentionally and obviously pointing out the fact that they didn't have any women on their executive leadership team. And that was not a point that I made in that room. My privilege went unacknowledged and unused in that situation. So I think it's important for individuals and especially for leaders to have some understanding of privilege and some appreciation for it. One of the quick little exercises I think that's kind of good to do to start helping yourself become aware of your own privilege is to think of the different aspects of your identity. Maybe take a look at this list of things, and within these different groups, identify how you identify. If I'm saying the word identify enough in that sentence. There's a couple of miscellaneous places at the end of that. If there's an important aspect of your identity that's not on this list, you can certainly include that. And once you've figured out how you identify in each of these categories, then here's some good questions for reflection. Out of those different aspects of your identity, which ones do you think of the most? Which ones do you think of the least? That probably gives you a little bit of insight into which aspects of your identity give you some privilege. If there's something that you think about a lot, that's probably an aspect of your identity where you're bumping up against some friction and have some disadvantage. If there's aspects of your identity you almost never have to think of, that's probably the areas where you're benefiting from privilege. It's an old reading, but it still holds up pretty well if you're fairly new to the idea of privilege. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh is a good foundational read. It goes back to, I think, the late 1980s, and she was writing and talking primarily about privilege relative to race and gender. But if you are new to this topic, it's a pretty good place to start. Good working language in there, a lot of everyday examples, might be a valuable resource for you. One of the other things that I want to lift up in this first bucket is bias, and there's a lot of connective tissue between privilege and bias. Privilege seems to be still poorly understood. Bias seems to be still kind of poorly understood as well. A lot of the conversations, debates, dialogues that I see and hear about bias are usually between people that aren't talking about the same thing. They're operating different ideas or different frameworks of bias. So let me just make a few kind of quick, what I think are important points. One of the things that seems to be getting in our way relative to bias is we seem to be clinging to this idea that there's kind of two groups of people in the world. There are good people, and what do we know about good people? Good people are open-minded and non-judgmental and free of bias, right? And probably every single one of us have said those things about ourselves. We've said, I don't judge a book by its cover. My mother didn't raise me that way. So there's good people, and they don't have any bias, and then there are bad people. And what do we know about bad people? Bad people are closed-minded and judgmental and dripping with bias, right? Which conveniently leaves all of the rest of us out of the conversation. If this is the reality, if we've got these two groups of people, then what is the work of fighting bias about? Well, it's kind of about finding these people so that we can fix them, isn't it? Which doesn't work very well. As much as we enjoy that idea, we do sometimes enjoy trying to point these folks out. It's not effective and it's not accurate. It's just a completely flawed understanding of human beings and human behavior. We know enough today about human behavior and especially the human brain to know that there is no such thing as a non-judgmental human being. We are naturally, automatically, relentlessly judgmental, and most of that bias doesn't have anything to do with hatred or bigotry. I'm not suggesting hatred and bigotry aren't real things. For sure they are. You probably just have to go and read the news to see some of them. But most bias doesn't have anything to do with hatred or bigotry. Most bias doesn't involve any conscious choice. It's an automatic product of how the brain interprets information. Most bias simply shows up as assumptions, things we think we know about other human beings. But it's important for us, if we care about talent, if we care about truth and accuracy and decision-making, it's really important that we do things to push back on the impact of bias. And some of that is stuff that we can do as individuals. We can educate ourselves on bias. We can educate our peers on bias. We can be more intentional about our decision-making. We can look for and challenge assumptions. But I think the biggest opportunity for us to get ahead of bias in the workplace isn't in individual behaviors, as important as those are, but it is in taking a look at our practices and our processes and looking for opportunities to redesign them based on what we know today about bias and automatic decision-making. A quick example of what I'm talking about. Many of you are probably familiar with Malcolm Gladwell. Gladwell is an author. He's written a bunch of articles and, gosh, 5, 6, maybe 7 books at this point. One of his books is a book called Blink. And Blink is not a new book by any means. It's maybe a decade old at this point. And it's not explicitly about bias, but it's about automatic decision-making, pros and cons. And towards the end of that book, he talks about classical musicians. So if you go back to about 1980 and you look at the orchestras and the symphonies in this country and in Europe, they were dominated by male musicians. It was a very male-heavy field. And every once in a while, there was the claim of gender bias. And every time those claims were made, the conductors that were staffing these orchestras and symphonies, they were always horribly offended. They said, you really think I'm picking musicians based on their gender? I don't care at all about gender. All I care about is talent. And you've probably heard something like that before in a different setting. They went on to say that it's not bias, it's science. Men are better musicians because they have more lung capacity and they have more muscles in their face and their cheeks. These were things that were said to justify what was obviously a biased outcome. But in the mid-1980s, they made some changes to the audition process. A couple of changes that are relative to this conversation. One change was they now put up a screen in front of you when you audition. So nobody knew who you were anymore. They just heard the music. They also put carpet down on the floor so no one could hear what kinds of shoes you were wearing as you walked up to audition behind the screen. And guess what started to change as soon as they made those two changes? The gender balance and who was invited to join those orchestras and symphonies. Those orchestras and symphonies are largely at parity today. So here's an example where we didn't fix anything on the individual level. Those conductors were still completely convinced they were free of bias, but we changed the process. We took some piece of information that shouldn't have anything to do with the decision and used some really strong implicit biases and removed it from the process. Those are the kinds of opportunities that we need to look for. And I realize there's probably not a lot of aspects of your work you can slap screens up in front of people, but these are the kinds of opportunities that we need to be looking for. There's a lot of organizations today that are paying a lot more attention to the language in their job descriptions because we know there's some bias there. Different language resonates with different populations. There's organizations that are removing names and gendered pronouns and dates from resumes before anyone sees them. There's organizations that are being a lot more intentional about the interview process, about the hiring decision process, and some of those things. Also keep in mind that bias isn't just about formal decision making. That's an important thing to pay attention to, but it's not just about formal decision making. It also shows up in our meetings, in our conversations. It shows up in who gets listened to and who doesn't get listened to, who gets interrupted and who doesn't get interrupted. So there's a lot of different places in your organization you can look to tackle this. And again, it's good for us to be aware and active on the individual level, but I think redesigning how we do things is probably our biggest opportunity to get ahead of this stuff. The bias component of this conversation has exploded in the past decade or two. If you're looking for more information, more research, more application, these are some of my favorite books on bias. If you're not a book person, there's no shortage of white papers and TED Talks and videos out there. There's a lot of information out there. It's very easy to educate yourself and your peers on bias. So there's some specific commitments you can make right there. You can commit to setting aside some time to getting clarity on your personal narrative and your personal why. You can educate yourself and start acting, understanding privilege. And there's also some things that you can do to educate yourself and take some actions towards mitigating the impact of bias. A few examples of things that you can do in that first bucket. So that first bucket is focused on self-awareness. It's the most kind of reflective and introspective of stuff that we're going to talk about. The second bucket requires us to start thinking about other folks. And really it's thinking about what is our orientation towards difference. How do we really feel about difference? How do we feel working around people that are different from us? How do we feel in conversations about difference? Here's your slide with way too many words on it. Again, this is just kind of for you to come back and review later. This language is also in the workbook that you're going to get that's kind of organized the same way this presentation is. A few specific things that I'll lift up in this bucket. This is largely about being more intentional about how we interact with folks that are different from us. And the first one is, I think, a fairly easy, simple one. Be intentional about using respectful and inclusive language. One of the narratives that I'm starting to hear kind of frequently is that, you know, I don't even want to engage in the conversation because I don't know what I can say and what I can't say. And I kind of understand that on one hand because our language is dynamic and it's kind of changing and evolving, and some of it's changing and evolving pretty quickly. But on the other hand, it's fairly easy to go out and educate yourself on what respectful and inclusive language is. And on the next slide, I've got a couple of, I think, 3 active links that are all online glossaries. And I think they're pretty solid online glossary. And you might want to create an internal glossary. But one of the things that will happen is if folks do have a glossary, if they do have some of that common language, it's going to feel a little bit safer to engage in the conversation. Excuse me. So that language is helpful. We don't want folks to use that as an excuse for not engaging in the conversation. The second point on here, and it's one sentence, but it's a really big chunk of work, but it is taking on a more intentional orientation about being curious, about being humble, and about being coachable. And I want to talk about the curious and the humble part of it first. There's 2 specific ways that I think, especially for leaders, it is important to be curious and to be humble. And one is to be curious and humble intellectually, to do a better job of inviting and truly hearing and considering the ideas and perspectives of folks that are different from you. And I think there's a little bit more work there than a lot of leaders assume there is. Inviting those perspectives, inviting those ideas. In my experience, it's not hard to find situations where employees aren't comfortable sharing that stuff. So again, I think there's a little bit more work there than a lot of leaders think about. In the next bucket, we're going to talk about psychological safety, and on the group level, that's where a lot of that work happens. But make sure that you're intentional about inviting ideas and perspectives from folks that are different from you. Gosh, I just lost my train of thought. There was something else I was going to say there, and it just completely jumped out of my head and ran away. If it comes back to me, I'll share it with you. The other way in which it's important for leaders to be curious and humble is ontologically. And that is about inviting not the ideas or perspectives of folks, but inviting their story, their experience. We have this tendency known as ontological arrogance as human beings. And as I understand it, that means that we have a tendency to believe that my experience is the experience. Everyone in this place is experiencing this place the same way that I am. And that's never the case. Even in this conversation, we're all having a little bit of a different experience. We're different people. We interpret things differently. We came here with different expectations. We're paying differing amounts of attention. We're all having a little bit of a different experience here. And I think for leaders, to be a leader for the whole team, the whole workplace, they need to come to understand the whole workplace. And there's simply aspects of the workplace that they're not experiencing firsthand. They have to learn about it from other folks. So doing a good job of making it truly safe for people to share their experience of working in that organization, walking through that office, walking through that plant. That's going to give you valuable information. And a lot of folks have stopped sharing that information because it doesn't feel safe. There's too many real or perceived risks or consequences. But being intentional about being intellectually capable, inviting the ideas and perspectives, and being ontologically curious and humble, inviting the experiences and the stories of people different from you. Those are valuable stories because they're seeing and experiencing things that you do not have direct access to yourself. And the last one on this line is to be coachable. As you become more involved in this work, as you become more of an ally, more of an inclusive leader, your intentions might be fantastic. You're still going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to stub your toe. You're going to use the wrong word. You're going to say things the wrong way. You have to remain coachable. You have to remain coachable so that folks can give you that feedback and that you can learn from it. That's one of the most powerful ways of learning. Most of the stuff I've learned about this work is the product of me making mistakes around caring and compassionate and courageous folks that helped me learn from that experience. So it's one line, but there's quite a bit of work in there. And then the last one I'm going to highlight in this bucket is to be intentional about bringing more diversity into your network. As much as we say things about embracing diversity and celebrating diversity, we still tend to surround ourselves with people that look and talk and think and walk a lot like we do. So there's value in growing your network. There's a different kind of value that comes from making sure that you're bringing diversity into your network. A few slides I'll share with you real quickly. This is the one that goes back to that first point, respectful and inclusive language. These aren't the only three, but these are three pretty good online glossaries that give you some good stuff to start with. And again, you might want to develop a glossary for your organization. I talked about, one of the points that I made was about being ontologically humble and curious, inviting the stories of other folks. You've seen this image before, but that's one of the ways in which I use this image. I use this as kind of a backdrop to invite folks to share their stories. The more honest they're willing and able to be in sharing their stories, the more actual information you have to being a solution for the things that they're bumping up against. If you don't know that it's going on, it's kind of hard for you to be a solution for that. The last point that I talked about in this bucket was about bringing diversity into your network. And I'm going to share with you a real quick social network analysis. And this might be valuable for you as an individual. It also might be a valuable thing to take back to your organization, especially having conversations around network diversity. So if you would, make sure you've got a pencil and a paper. I'm just going to ask you 4 questions. And what I'm going to try to do is convince you to try to write down 5 people's names for each of these questions. And we'll click through it kind of quickly, so you might not get that many, but try to think of 5 unique names in answer to each of these questions. So the first question is this: from time to time, people discuss important matters with other people. Looking back over the past 6 months, who are the people with whom you discuss matters important to you? So try to write down up to 5 names. And this is for your eyes only, so they can be initials or nicknames, or you can draw funny pictures of them as long as you know who that means. Question number 2 is, consider the people that you communicate with in order to get your work done. Of all the people you've communicated with in the past 6 months, who has been the most important for getting your work done? And again, don't write down anybody's name more than once, because we're just going to look at the total list anyway. So try to come up with 5 unique names. Question 3, consider an important project or initiative that you're involved in. Consider the people who would be influential for getting it approved or obtain the resources you need. Who would you talk to get that support? Same drill, up to 5 unique names. And the last question is about socializing. Who do you socialize with? Spending time with people after work hours, visiting them at home, going to social events, going out for meals. Over the past 6 months, who are the main people with whom you have socialized informally? Up to 5 unique names. And so if you spend a little bit of time reflecting, you can get 20 names, and this is a list of people that maybe you've not ever thought about before. You might not even like some of the folks on this list, but it's a pretty important group of people in your life. There's a lot of the ideas and information you're exposed to come through these people. How you feel about those ideas, and that information is heavily influenced by these people. There's a lot of interesting research done around this as kind of one of the core social networks. And if we understand the value of difference, if we understand the value of diversity, this should be one of the places where we want it. So when you get done and you've got your list of 12 or 15 or 20 names, do a little bit of a demographic analysis. Step back and take a look at that list, and in general, do you see a lot of difference there or not? And some of you probably do, but most of you probably don't. The research, even on a national level, says that our networks of relationships are pretty siloed and pretty segregated, especially around race and ethnicity, increasingly around faith and politics, which means that across those lines of difference, we are not really talking with each other, we are talking about each other, and we are uninformed about each other. And there's lots of consequences that come from that. So this is an opportunity for you to think about being more intentional about this, bringing more diversity into your personal and professional networks of relationships, setting aside a little bit of time and effort and energy. And I don't think the approach is to sit out this weekend and I'm going to meet one of these folks, or I'm going to meet someone from this group. I don't think that is the approach. I think the approach is about relentlessly leaving your comfort zone, going to different places, thinking about what you do with your professional development time, your social time, your volunteer time. Can you go to some different places to do that stuff? You'll know you found a different place when you feel some discomfort. There's a reason why you haven't been going there. If you, based on my experience, if you follow that discomfort, your network will fill with diversity. And there's a lot of benefits to that. As you get more diversity in your network, you're going to be exposed to different stories, different ideas, different information. You will probably learn some things about your community. You'll probably learn some things about your workplace. You will probably learn some things about yourself. So there's a lot of value to do that, even if it's setting aside one morning a month to have breakfast with someone that you don't know. That is going to have an impact. So I don't think it needs to be a huge investment of time. Simply being intentional about, am I going to different places? Am I introducing myself to new people? There's value in doing that. So a few different things you can tackle in that bucket. The third bucket is very much focused on the team. So we started by thinking a little bit about ourselves. Then we started thinking about, what is our orientation towards difference? Do I have access to difference? Am I learning from that difference? The third bucket, or the third layer of this work, is very much about the team, right? So as a leader, this is specific to me and the group of people that report to me, my team. And here's your slide with way too many words on it. You can read and review that at a later time. The things that I want to lift up in this particular bucket are the importance of building one-on-one relationships, getting to know the individual members of your team. I think for those of you that are still in a remote work situation, this is even more important now. Making sure that you're investing the time and energy to have those one-on-one relationships. You need to get to know the ways in which the people on your team are different. There are different comfort levels with talking in front of a group. There are different comfort levels with conflict. All of those things vary a lot from person to person. They're important to know. The more that you know the individual members, I think the better job you can do of creating a safe space for all of those folks as a team. Paying attention to in-group, out-group dynamics. I think just about every team has a certain amount of that, and a lot of times we just kind of pretend like it doesn't exist. If you want those folks to feel welcome and belonging and included, You've got to do things to get rid of those in-group, out-group dynamics on your team. But the primary thing that I want to talk about in this bucket, and the primary thing that I think about in this bucket, is psychological safety. And that's a little bit of a newer topic, or at least the language is a little bit newer for folks. So let me dig into that a little bit, just to make sure that everyone has some appreciation for what it is and what it does. For a lot of folks, psychological safety has shown up on the radar screen just within the past few years because of a really fantastic full-length article in the New York Times about some research that came out of Google under the name Project Aristotle. Google was simply trying to answer the question, what makes a great team? What makes a smart team, a talented team? They had some ideas, they had some guesses, some assumptions, but they had never collected the data. And Google loves data, and they went out and collected a mountain of it. They tracked almost 200 internal teams, almost 300 data points on each team. They did focus groups and interviews, tremendous amount of data. And there was 5 things that sorted out of this data, 5 things that were closely correlated with team performance. These are those 5 things. The number one indicator of team performance at Google is what they call psychological safety. As Google defines it, psychological safety is when team members feel safe taking risks and being vulnerable in front of each other. So we are on the team together, regardless of who I am, regardless of who you are. I'm willing and able to share my big crazy idea. I'm willing and able to ask the uncomfortable question. I am willing and able to challenge or disagree with anybody in this group as long as I do so respectfully. Right? Going back to kind of at a very foundational level, this is about, can we be true and tell the truth to each other? Psychological safety. And sometimes when I share this research, this particular study, people say, well, we're not Google. And I get it. Psychological safety isn't specific to Google. The research on psychological safety goes back at least to 1968. We've got studies across industry, across profession. There's meta studies that have been done. We know a lot about what it is and where it comes from out beyond Google. In the research literature, the definition of psychological safety is generally a little bit different than the language that Google uses, but still talking about the same thing. Sense of people not be embarrassed or punished for speaking up. It's safe for me to say what I want to say in this team. Okay? We know what the antecedents or the causes or the roots of psychological safety are. There are these things, especially the top 2, role clarity and peer support. So if we want to increase the psychological safety of a team, these are our levers. These are our dials. These are the things that we work with, our variables. And most of my work around psychological safety is focused completely on role clarity. The more clear you can make it for folks what they're going to do and how they're expected to participate, the safer it is for them to participate. One of the places where we see this is in, I mentioned earlier the importance of disagreement done well. A lot of teams don't have that ability. And part of the reason why they don't have a healthy relationship with disagreement is they've never said out loud or written down, this is what we're going to do. This is how you're expected to participate. This is how we're going to do what we're going to do together. Without that, disagreeing with each other, which is already emotionally taxing, looks even bigger and scarier than it actually needs to be. But these are the things that we can use to increase the psychological safety of a group. We also know what the fruits, what the product, what the outcome of psychological safety are. There are these things. And this is a pretty righteous list of things. Information sharing, satisfaction, learning, engagement, improved performance, pretty fantastic stuff. Inclusion's not even on the list. But we're doing this as an inclusion intervention. And I don't know if I made this point earlier or not, but while we tend to tackle this work on the organizational level, I think some of the best and some of the cheapest inclusion interventions are actually on the team level. And I would put psychological safety at the top of that list. So we know what it comes from. We know what the outcomes are. We also know that's very much correlated with the idea of inclusion. If you increase the psychological safety of a team, you're going to increase how included those folks feel like they are. And this is also something that should be not only connected to our diversity inclusion efforts, but psychological safety should also be anchored in our conversations and our efforts around talent. Most of you care about talent. Your organization cares about talent. Unfortunately, our conversations about talent have been kind of one-dimensional. We're still focusing on talented individuals. We're trying to find talented, smart, competent individuals. And that matters, and it's always going to matter. But as we do more and more of our work together in groups, in teams, and networks, we also need to have a conversation about what makes a talented team. And that's a different body of work. We seem to be operating under the idea that if we group smart people together, we will have smart groups, and it does not work that way. At the group level, individual ability actually becomes a pretty small variable. The biggest variables for talented teams, especially if you have teams that have decision-making and problem-solving work to do, is diversity. Do they carry different stories, different data, different lenses, and inclusion? Can they tell the truth to each other? Can they share those differences? Can they disagree with each other and challenge each other? Diversity and inclusion have to be central to the idea of talent in our organization, especially the conversation around building smart and talented and competent teams. If you want to dig more into the research behind psychological safety, these are 3 really good books. I will lift up the book on the right. Amy Edmondson is kind of the leading thinker and talker about psychological safety, but all 3 of these books are very good. They're very much about psychological safety, and they kind of attack it from different places. So there's some good research in here. There's some good application in here. If you're not a book person, there's also a lot of articles and other resources out there regarding psychological safety. Self, other, team, and then that last bucket, that last layer of work, we kind of bring things back to the organizational level, and I won't make a whole lot of points or comments specific to this bucket. Here's your obligatory slide with too many words on it. 3 things that I will mention in this bucket. I do think that it is important for leaders to know the formal business case for their organization and be comfortable sharing it. Not just know the words, but understand it and be comfortable sharing it. I think it's also important for leaders, organizational leaders, to find ways to take personal ownership. Diversity inclusion might not be in their title, but as leaders, they are stewards of the culture. They have a critical role to play in this work. And so I think it's important to encourage them to look for opportunities to take personal ownership. And there's a lot of different ways that I think leaders can do this. One of the ways they can take personal ownership is they can make public and specific commitments. And the conversation that we've been having today might give you some ideas for what some of those commitments might look like. Make specific and public commitments. I'm committed to being a more inclusive leader, and this is how I'm going to do that. It might be in helping it might be in getting actively involved in the organization's diversity and inclusion efforts, getting involved in diversity councils, employee resource groups, bringing new resources in the organization. It might be in getting involved in this work outside the organization, maybe in the community, maybe in the industry. But finding ways to take personal ownership of this. We've got to get away from this idea that this work is a side project or an HR initiative. It is not remotely either one of those things. It is much bigger and much broader than that. And leadership has a critical role to play, especially in the inclusion piece. I would say that more so than anything else, inclusion is the product of a certain kind of leadership. Leaders have a central and a critical role to play in this. It's not enough for them just to show up for an occasional meeting. They've got to find some ways to take ownership for this. And another important role that leaders have to make in the organization is holding folks accountable. At the very beginning of this conversation, I talked about the fact that one of the things that we're struggling with is accountability. And so one of the ways that leaders can contribute to that is they can make sure that they're holding their direct reports accountable on this stuff. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of opportunities for accountability in the organization, and especially those things that leaders are going to bump up against, the language, the conversation, some of the behaviors that they're going to bump up against that don't violate policy, that don't break the law, but they're not inclusive in nature. When I work with leaders, I encourage them to think about those situations and to be proactive in thinking about how they might respond to those situations. Because I think we always think we're going to respond to those situations, but it happens, and I don't know if I heard the person right, and it was kind of in the heat of the moment, and all of a sudden the moment passed and I didn't do anything about it. And so I think it's important to think in advance about the next time I hear this word or I bump up against this narrative, this is how I'm going to respond to it. The next time I walk through the break room and somebody is talking about how so-and-so is a diversity promotion, what am I going to do to interrupt that conversation? What stories do I need to take? What data do I need to take? What am I going to anchor that conversation in? And one of the things that I oftentimes encourage leaders to do is, rather than making that a diversity inclusion conversation, making it a values conversation. Most organizations have pretty good shared values in place. And if they really think about it, diversity and inclusion is kind of woven through most of those values. And it's just going to come across a little bit differently. A really fantastic phrase is, we don't do that here. And the reason we don't do that here because of these values. This is who we claim to be as an organization. That simple phrase coming from a leader can have a pretty profound impact. There's a lot of stuff that I think you're going to bump up against that doesn't warrant calling HR and making it into a formal affair, but it still requires some kind of response. still requires some kind of action. So this is another opportunity for kind of reflection and planning. The next time I hear this, the next time I see this, the next time these folks start this conversation, how am I going to show up? What am I going to say in response to that? And then that allows me to think about, what are they going to say in response to that? And the more time I spend thinking and scenario planning that, I think the better equipped we are going to be to show up in those conversations and to be effective. We want to be effective. And one of the things that sometimes gets in the way of that, some of these conversations activate pretty powerful emotions. And sometimes we respond emotionally in those conversations. And we might say things that are true, and we might say things that feel good, but they might not be terribly effective. Sometimes the truest thing in the world might be to say, well, I think you're just racist. It might be true, it might feel good, it might resonate with you. Excuse me, again, it's rarely effective in those conversations. We want to choose our tools and our tactics effectively. So thinking about some of those situations we're going to find ourselves in, and thinking about how we might respond to those situations and show up in those situations. Excuse me. Having a hard time getting that throat all the way cleared today. So we've got these 4 buckets of competencies, commitments, behaviors, practices. I'm never sure which is the right word to do, but and this is just an overview. Those buckets contain more stuff. There's more stuff that can be in those buckets. But when I have time to go through this content with leaders, what I generally invite them to do is to try to find maybe a couple of specific things that they're willing to commit to in each of those buckets. And then start finding some opportunities to share those commitments. Those commitments are going to become a little bit more real and a little bit more serious once you've spoken them out loud, once you've said them to some other people. It's good to hold yourself accountable, but it also invites them to engage in maybe some of the same process themselves. I think there's kind of a nice mix of things in here, so you can actually make a couple of commitments in each of those buckets, but it's not a whole entire separate job. Some of these things you can do without huge investments of time, but hopefully they give you some ideas of behaviors and commitments that you can make as an individual, but also maybe some stuff that you can take back to your organization. And now we've got some good time for questions and answers. Let me take down my slides here. But hopefully there's some valuable content. Again, you'll get the slides that you just saw. You're also going to get a workbook that complements it. But let's see what we might have for questions. So it looks like there's a few questions in the chat feature. Maybe I can start there. And I'll just start at the bottom because that's the easiest place for me to start. So the first question I see is, what are some recommended best first steps for creating safe spaces within organizations to begin these discussions? So I would go back to the psychological safety content as a big part of that. And maybe even think a little bit about the language, because the phrase safe spaces is thrown around a lot in different contexts. And it's not always clear to me what people are saying when they say safe spaces. I think sometimes the desire to create a safe space is about protecting people from offense. And I think there are some times in some places where that's a valuable thing to do. Psychological safety is maybe a little bit different than that. And sometimes the way that I talk about psychological safety is it's about creating brave spaces. Psychological safety is not going to prevent you from offense. The more truth we tell to each other, the more likely it is that we're going to get offended. There's some things that we can do to, there's some ground rules and some parameters that we can put on that. We do want it to be safe. We want to protect people, but there is going to be a certain amount of disagreement and conflict there. It's about having honest and safe conversations. But if you want to create safe spaces to engage in some of these conversations, I think it starts with psychological safety, doing some things to make sure that we are comfortable telling the truth to each other. The number one tool that I use for creating psychological safety for teams is what I call agreements. Sometimes people call them ground rules or guiding principles, but I work with the team to put agreements in place for how we're going to have meetings and how we're going to have our conversations, with special focus on some of the more difficult stuff, like disagreeing with each other. How are we going to make decisions? How are we going to deal with disagreement? How am I expected to participate as an individual? And groups are pretty good at coming up with those ground rules or those agreements. The problem is they never hold themselves accountable. We write all that great stuff down on the flip chart, and 90 seconds later, we're not paying any attention to it. It's got to be operationalized. So a team that I worked with recently wanted to increase their psychological safety and how inclusive their team felt. We spent some time building these agreements, and they review those agreements at the beginning of every meeting. They read them out loud. And at the end of every meeting, they do an accountability check. They go around and they talk about what are things that I can do better next time? What are things that we can do better next time? So I think psychological safety is a big part of that answer. One of the other things I would go back to is the importance of common language. Putting common language in place so that when we have these conversations, we're talking about the same thing. And not just with diversity and inclusion, but also things like race and racism and systemic racism. There's a whole bunch of arguments about systemic racism right now that are not between people talking about the same thing. They have very different ideas of what that means in their head. Those conversations are rarely meaningful or valuable or actionable. If we get to the point where we're talking about the same thing, those conversations can be more meaningful and actionable. And so I think the two things that are top of mind for me in answering that question are common language and psychological safety. I see another question about where can we get information with the 4 buckets. You will get the slide deck. You also get a workbook that's organized around those 4 buckets as well.
Joe, we have one question. As a team leader, I am expected to get along with everyone on the team. How do I grow my cultural competencies and build stronger bridges with my teammates?
That's a really good question. And I think, I touched on a little bit of that on the team level, but probably not enough. I think a lot of it is about spending time getting to know the folks on your team, creating a situation where they're comfortable sharing their story and their truth with you. I think that in itself is going to help you become more cultural competent. But there's a lot of, unlike most times in history, there's a lot of self-education that you can do. There's so many resources that are available. There are books, there are documentaries. It's very easy today to learn about the experiences of people different from you in the workplace, outside of the workplace. So I would focus on that. I would set aside some time to do a little bit of self-education, and I would focus some time building those one-on-one relationships with your team members. We've kind of convinced ourselves that there's a lot of stuff that isn't work-related, and so we shouldn't talk about it at work. I think that's problematic. I think trusting, resilient relationships come from spending time together and getting to know each other. And so you can't just talk about work. You've got to get to know each other. You got to get to know each other's backgrounds, your likes, your dislikes, your preferences, your comfort levels. And that doesn't come from the org chart, and it doesn't come from sales. It comes from spending time getting to know each other. Maybe the biggest challenge in that question is setting aside that time, because most of us don't have big buckets of unused time on our calendar. But those are a couple of things that I think will be helpful.
The next question that we have is, how do we increase diversity in our hiring practices? What are some actions that can assist in recruiting diverse applicants?
So that's like a 90-minute answer, probably there. Good question. A couple of things that are top of mind. I think that the bias piece is a big part of that. Making sure that the folks that are involved in that process have been educated on bias and start looking at the different parts of that process, looking for some opportunities to redesign it. Again, as far out as the language in your job descriptions. One of the examples I've come across is that in the tech industry, if your job description has the word hack or hacker or hacking, you're going to get a lot more men that apply for that job than women. That word just resonates differently. If you change the language, you can actually change the graphic profile of who applies for your job. So start looking at every step in that talent process. Job descriptions. Where do those job descriptions go? Do you have relationships with different communities? Do you have relationships with different professional associations? How do you interact with resumes? Who sees that information? What information do they see? Do you have a diverse team that's doing the actual interviewing? Do you have a consistent interview process? Do you have a consistent hiring decision process? Most organizations have lots of improvement in all of those areas, but I think those are some of the most important ones to pay attention to.
Our next question is, I want to work on building a more diverse circle of friends for my family. How can I do that in a way that keeps me psychologically safe and open to learning about those different from me?
Good question. I feel like that's a pretty contextual question. It really depends on the person. One of the things I'll mention again is I think you can start to educate yourself and your family on your own to some extent. Books, websites, webinars, videos, documentaries, there's a lot of that stuff out there available. I think that's always a good place to start. I think, pay attention to what you do with your social time. Pay attention to the books that you introduce your kids to, the stories, the narratives, the characters that you introduce your kids to. Pay attention to the movies that you watch. I think all of those are opportunities to be intentional. Me and my kids we all kind of enjoy art. So that's one of the ways that I'm pretty intentional about exposing them to different people in different places, because there's art in a lot of different communities. And that's a fairly consistent thing, but you can experience it different ways in different neighborhoods and different communities. So that might be a thing. I think sports provides an opportunity to intersect with other people and other communities. So again, I think some of it is fairly easy to do and you can educate yourself on, and some of it is paying attention to the things that you and your family are already interested in and involved in, looking for different places and different ways to do some of those things. I think that's oftentimes a fairly safe way to do that. When I invite leaders to do that personal narrative work, to reflect on their own story and their own journey, it's staggering to me how many of those stories involve team sports at some level. How the first time they interact with people that were different from them was basketball or track or some type of project like that. And so I think those are valuable ways to interact with people around something that you're already interested in or care about. If I said that in a way that makes sense.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, how can we reframe diversity to expand beyond race, ethnicity, and sex to include persons with disabilities and other sexual and gender orientations or identities?
That's a really great question. I think language is incredibly powerful, and this is a question that I struggle with a lot. The way that I use the word diversity is that it means difference. And there's a lot of ways in which we can be different from each other, probably countless ways. And I think there's some real value and some real need to bring more aspects of identity into the diversity conversation. At the same time, I think it's pretty easy to understand that not all differences are created the same. Whether you are left-handed or right-handed is not the same thing as whether you are black or white in this country, in your community, in the workplace. And so I think you can talk about diversity as difference, and you can talk about a lot of ways in which we're different. Some of it is our external identity, some of it's our internal identity, physical abilities. There's a lot of ways in which we can be different. I still think you have to be able to have a little bit of a nuanced conversation around prioritizing things. These different aspects of identity, they have different histories behind them, different kinds of context, and they have different consequences. One of the downsides to saying that diversity means different is that sometimes people want to run away and say, well, I graduated from this college and he graduated from that college, so we're diverse and we don't need to do any more work. And we don't want that to happen. Not that that's not an actual difference, but it's not a terribly meaningful, important difference. And so I think in most organizations, there needs to be a more nuanced conversation about the language and what it means and why. And even there needs to be a bigger conversation around identity and the different components of identity. That's kind of a rambling answer to a good question. I'm not sure if I answered it or not, but a few thoughts in response to that question.
Thank you. Do you think we can do more to teach empathy to children in the classroom at school? And is there a way to focus on it as a discipline, or should we use empathy as a way to critically think about the world?
Really good question. I had to think about that last part. I think there's absolutely an opportunity and a need to teach empathy in school, in elementary school, in high school, in college, and in the workplace. We still seem to be lacking a certain amount of empathy. So I do think that's an important thing to focus on. I know there's some folks out there that probably do. I don't know if I know what the most effective way to teach empathy is to adults or to kids, but I think there is a need and an opportunity there. And I think the second part of the question had something to do with critically engaging with the world or learning about the world. And I think that's one of the big things that empathy offers. Rather than being dismissive of you because of what I think I know about you, approaching it with that curiosity, with some empathy, and realizing that everybody I meet has a different story. Everyone I meet carries different data, and I can learn if I have the right kind of relationship with them. I can learn from that. I can learn from their experience. And I think that oftentimes doesn't happen with empathy. We get stuck in this place of maybe tolerance where, I'm okay being around you, but I believe something about you, and so I just don't pay attention to what you have to say or what you have to offer. I think empathy is a big part of what changes that.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can someone go about rebuilding trust on a team when someone has violated that trust? For example, using a racial slur when the person did not realize I was in the room.
Whew. After this, can we get maybe some yes/no questions? So that's a pretty big question. Some of it depends on who you are and where you work. I think in a lot of situations, the possible solution for that might be that maybe that person shouldn't be there anymore. And organizations are different, and situations are different, and mistakes are different from patterns of behavior. But again, if this stuff matters, it matters. And there should be some real consequences to that kind of behavior. And the onus shouldn't be on you to rebuild that trust. Building trust is hard. Rebuilding trust is even harder, especially with that kind of violation. So it really kind of depends on the context. Is this connected to an ongoing pattern of behavior? Was this really a strange situation or a mistake? And what is your willingness to engage in that? I don't think the onus should be on you to rebuild that trust. You're not the one that broke it. You're not the one that violated that relationship. So I guess I'm really not answering your question at all. If you decide that you do want to rebuild that trust, I think that comes from spending time together and having that incredibly difficult conversation. That person needs to know not only what you heard, but the consequences of that, how that felt, and they need to take some ownership for that. There's this idea that's oftentimes associated with diversity inclusion work that we always have to assume positive intent. And I think that that's a good thing, but it can't stand on its own. We can only assume positive intent if the people having those good intentions are willing to own the outcomes of their intentions and impacts are different things. If let's say Tatiana decides that her and I should become friends, and she's going to take the first step towards that friendship. She's actually going to come to my house on Saturday and hang out with me. Pretty big step, right? So Saturday comes along and Tatiana comes to my house, and unfortunately for Tatiana, I'm not a very interesting person, and after like 5 minutes, we've run out of things to talk about. We have an awkward social situation. Now, my life is kind of filled with awkward social situations, and I suggest to Tatiana that maybe we should go to my backyard and have some archery practice, like many of you would in an awkward social situation. And I pull out my bow and arrow and my target, and it's my house, so I'm going to go first and put the target up, and I aim for the very center, and I shoot the arrow. Instead of hitting the target, I hit Tatiana in the shoulder. Now, super awkward social situation now, right? Now, it's important for her to know what my intentions were. It's important for her to know that I didn't try to do that. It doesn't change the fact that she has an arrow in her shoulder, right? I can't walk away and say, I don't know what you're looking at me for. I was aiming way over there. I have to own that outcome. And so if we're going to assume positive intent, there's got to be another expectation that comes with that, is that even when I have positive intent, when I make a mistake, when I break something, when something gets scratchy, I have to fix that. I can't just walk away letting myself off the hook with good intentions. Now, in this situation, I don't even know that we can assume positive intent. Again, there's some contextual stuff I don't realize. But this idea of giving people the benefit of the doubt, like there's got to be some accountability for that to mean anything. Your intentions only matter if you own the outcomes and the impacts. And again, I don't know if that's relative to this particular example or not, but a little bit of an answer to you. And then you had that experience.
Thank you. Our next question is the equal opportunity hire still a thing, or are companies leaning to have a more diverse workforce?
I'm not sure I understand that question. I think most companies are doing things to bring in a more diverse workforce. I think the demographic numbers in most industries are moving pretty slowly, but I think most organizations, especially bigger organizations, are focusing some amount of effort on bringing more diversity in. I think the piece that isn't really happening in a lot of those organizations is the inclusion piece. I worked with a city county government, not Tallahassee or Florida, but I worked on a city county government project a few years ago. And the catalyst behind it was the mayor. The mayor literally wouldn't stop talking about diversity when he was campaigning. When he was elected, he put in place a very diverse leadership team or cabinet. It was very diverse, and they were very proud of that. But they brought me in to develop some inclusive leadership training for city and county managers. And as I got comfortable with a couple of the folks on that leadership team, they let me know that, well, we are a very diverse team, but when we come together as a group, there's one way to think, and the mayor will let you know what that is, right? Very diverse team, not in a very inclusive culture. They're still in that kind of assimilation place. I think that's where a lot of organizations are at. And so I think there are organizations working on diversity. I think there's more work to do there, but it's also important that we catch up with the inclusion aspect of this work as well.
Thank you. And sort of on that note, what are some recommended first steps to creating safe spaces within organizations so that we can begin having some of these conversations?
Yeah, that was the question I spoke to first. I think that's the two biggest things that I can think of are that common language and start to build the psychological safety, put some agreements in place for what we're going to talk about, how we're going to talk about it, what kinds of behaviors and communication styles are accepted for that conversation.
What is the most radical diversity and inclusion initiative that you have observed or witnessed within your travels in the business?
What a great question. You know, I don't know that I've seen anything that qualifies as radical. I feel like we've been kind of stuck in a cycle where organizations are kind of all doing the same things. I don't know if this qualifies as radical. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of organizations doing today is they're having some programming and some efforts that are kind of specifically for middle-aged straight white men. In a lot of organizations, in big organizations, a lot of them have diversity councils and employee resource groups and training, and the folks that are most directly impacted and involved in that tend to be the other folks, tend to be the employees of color, tend to be women, other underrepresented or marginalized groups. For a number of reasons, middle-aged straight white men haven't been a part of those conversations and sometimes haven't felt like they were supposed to be part of those conversations. And so you've got kind of two different conversations going on inside the organization. And the folks that are involved in the active programs, they're still going back and they're working with coworkers and superiors that oftentimes are in that demographic group. And so I've seen more and more organizations trying to make sure that middle-aged white men in management positions are getting up to speed and getting educated on bias and privilege and some of these other topics, psychological safety. I don't know that qualifies as radical. I see it as an emerging trend. I think there's going to be a lot more focus on technology and data moving forward. Our ability to use that stuff is just exploding, and it's never really been central to this work. There's a lot of technology coming into this space. There's a lot of data expertise coming into this space. Again, I don't know if there's anything I've seen yet that I would say is radical. I think this work will be in a profoundly different place 5 or 10 years from now. There's a lot of new information, a lot of new tools, a lot of new folks coming into this work. I think it's going to have a pretty profound impact on it. I'm still waiting for that good yes/no question that I can crush before we end. Might not get it.
A comment/question. You mentioned eliminating bias in our processes, in particular with hiring and promotional processes. Would you recommend numeric/blind hiring/promotional lists that are performance-based in all areas of the work? This person says, I work in a physically demanding career and could imagine that this would enhance some disparities of diversity within the organization when it comes to those processes and certain career fields.
Yes, I think I'm in favor of all of the things that you mentioned at the front end of that question. Anything that we can do to bring more data into it makes it easier to show the impact that bias has. I think I'm in favor of all of the things that you mentioned in that question. I think that whole process, I think we've convinced ourselves we're much better at identifying talent than we actually are. I still don't think we're best at identifying the best person for the job. I think as humans, what we're best at identifying is people that we feel comfortable with. And that's usually pretty strongly correlated with people that are like us. and that gets in the way of talent. So I think there's a lot of room for opportunity there, and that's another aspect of this work that I think will be vastly different 5 or 10 years from today than it is now.
A piggyback question, we've talked extensively about mitigating bias, but do you ever think that we will truly be able to eliminate it entirely?
No.
That
I
was
think
our
we can
yes,
do a
no
great deal
question.
to. I think we can do a great deal to eliminate the consequences of bias. Properly understood, bias is simply a part of the human experience. As much as we like the idea of being non-judgmental, we don't have that setting. There's a whole big chunk of our brain that is trying to keep us alive, and in order to do that, it's always trying to predict the immediate near future. It's constantly jumping to conclusions and making assumptions. We're never going to turn that off. We can do a number of things to reduce the negative consequences of that.
Thank you, Joe. And our
You
last
bet.
question is how to respond to white men who feel and believe that they are being discriminated against because diversity initiatives are being rolled out in their organization.
There's a whole conversation there. So some of it goes back to what I said about common language. I think one of the most valuable things you can do if you're going to do work and talk about things like diversity and inclusion is to put clear and concise definitions in place in your organization. Without that, people that walk into those conversations and walk into that rooms have a whole bunch of different ideas about what that stuff is about. There are people that think when you say diversity, you mean getting rid of all of the white men. There are people that hear the word inclusion and think it's about tolerance or affirmative action or compliance. Those things aren't true, but that's what's in people's minds. So there's a certain amount of resistance that you can get rid of just by clarifying what it is that you're talking about. They're not actually resistant to the work that you want to do. They're resistant to the work that they think you want to do. So common language is part of it. I think engaging those white men in an open, honest conversation about this work, about the data, about workforce demographics is valuable as well. But this goes back to what I said about some organizations are starting to do some programming specifically to white men because they haven't been in the meetings. They haven't been going to the efforts. They haven't been going to classes. They're oftentimes uninformed and misinformed about what this work is and what its priorities are. So common language and engaging them in the conversation, and maybe that has to be in pretty small groups at first. But I think those are a couple of tools you can use to push back on that.
Thank you, Joe, for such a great presentation. It definitely made me reflect on how my office values diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do you think, Tatiana?
Certainly for myself, I am very pleased to work with an entity that values the whole person and puts DEI work at the forefront of all that we do. I've greatly enjoyed your presentation. I'm sure all of our attendees have as well.
Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.